I was born in 1961, born to an actress, showgirl, that had an affair with my father. My father is Elvis Presley. And later on in life, I found that I was, adopted and, proceeded to take over and find everything.
For decades, whispers have followed him everywhere he went. The man who called himself Elvis Presley Jr. lived under a shadow he could never escape, a shadow cast by the most famous name in music history. Was he truly the hidden son of Elvis Presley, or just another figure caught up in the myth and madness of the King's legacy? The rumors were relentless. Some believed his story, pointing to striking resemblances in his voice, his look, and his stage presence. Others dismissed him outright, labeling him a fraud, a pretender, someone exploiting Elvis's name for attention. But no matter how loud the debates grew, one truth remained. There had never been solid proof. Only claims, only speculation, only stories that shifted depending on who was telling them. Until now. After years of speculation, after a lifetime of being questioned, Elvis Presley Jr. finally faced the truth the world had demanded. He took the test that could end the debate once and for all. A DNA test. And when the results came back, they carried more than just science. They carried history. They carried heartbreak. They carried the power to rewrite the story of Elvis Presley's family forever. Think about the weight of that moment. This wasn't just about a man trying to prove who his father was. This was about touching the untouchable myth of Elvis Presley. For generations, Elvis has been more than a performer. He has been an American icon, a cultural deity whose name still draws millions to Graceland every year. To claim blood relation to him wasn't just personal, it was seismic. It meant stepping into a legacy drenched in both adoration and controversy. And the stakes couldn't have been higher. If the DNA confirmed Elvis Presley Jr.'s claim, then everything fans thought they knew about Elvis's private life would be shattered. It would mean that the king, who lived under such intense public scrutiny, had secrets even his closest followers never knew. If the DNA disproved it, then it would mean a lifetime of carrying another man's identity, and the ridicule that came with it was built on a painful lie. Either way, Elvis Presley Jr.'s entire existence would be changed forever. When the truth came out, it sent shockwaves through the Elvis community. Fans who had dismissed him were forced to listen. Supporters who had believed in him for decades finally had the confirmation or the heartbreak they had waited for. And for Elvis Presley Jr. himself, the results didn't just answer a question, they redefined his entire life. But here's the part that stunned everyone. The answer wasn't simple. The DNA test revealed truths that were more complicated than anyone expected. It didn't just confirm or deny, it forced the world to face questions about Elvis's life, his relationships, and his hidden struggles that had never been fully understood. Suddenly, Elvis Presley Jr. wasn't just a man with a claim, he was a man holding the key to a story that could shake the foundation of the Presley legacy. Imagine carrying that weight for a lifetime. Growing up with whispers about who your father might be, never knowing whether the blood in your veins tied you to history's most famous performer or whether it tied you to someone else entirely. Then imagine finally holding the proof in your hands, knowing that whatever the truth was, it would change not just your life, but the story of Elvis Presley himself. That is the burden Elvis Presley Jr. carried when he revealed the DNA results, and it is why this moment matters. Because this isn't just a story about science, it's a story about identity, about the collision of myth and man, about the price of living in Elvis Presley's shadow. For Elvis Presley Jr., the DNA test was more than medical evidence. It was a key that unlocked decades of pain, hope, and uncertainty. But as the world listened to his revelation, one question remained unanswered. Who exactly was his real father? If it wasn't Elvis, then who had left him carrying this story all his life? And if it was Elvis, then what did that mean for the Presley family? For Graceland? For the millions who thought they knew the king? The DNA test didn't just reveal a truth, it opened a door into a mystery far bigger than one man's claim. And as Elvis Presley Jr. stood ready to finally speak the words the world had been waiting to hear, fans braced themselves for a revelation that would shake not just a family tree, but an entire legacy. Before the DNA test, before the headlines, before the world began arguing about science and legacy, there was just a boy growing up in the shadows of a name too heavy for anyone to carry. Elvis Presley Jr. wasn't born into a normal childhood. He was born into a storm of whispers, half-truths, and rumors that followed him everywhere. From the very start, his life was defined not by who he was, but by who people said his father might be. The story of his birth was tangled in mystery. Some claimed his mother had been connected to Elvis during one of the King's many tours, a fleeting romance hidden from the world. Others dismissed it as fantasy, a fabricated tale designed to link an ordinary child to a legend. The truth, however, was never clear. There were no official acknowledgments, no public statements, only the quiet hum of speculation. And in that silence, the boy who would become Elvis Presley Jr. had to carve out his own identity. But carving out that identity was nearly impossible. Everywhere he went, the comparisons were there. People looked at him and said they saw echoes of the King, in his features, in his voice, in the way he carried himself. Some treated him with awe, as if he was living proof of Elvis's secret life. Others treated him with cruelty, mocking him as a pretender, someone chasing a last name he had no right to claim. It was a double-edged sword, adored by some, ridiculed by others, never allowed to simply be himself. What made it harder was that the Elvis myth was everywhere. Graceland was open to the public. The radio still played jailhouse rock, Suspicious Minds, and Love Me Tender as if Elvis had never left. His movies rolled on television, his face stared from posters and collector's items, his legend loomed over American culture like a mountain that could never be climbed. And for Elvis Presley Jr., that mountain wasn't just a cultural icon, it was a personal ghost. He couldn't escape the shadow of the man he might, or might not, have been connected to by blood. Still, he tried to forge his own path. Drawn to music himself, Elvis Presley Jr. stepped into the spotlight, performing on stages and releasing songs. For him, it wasn't just about carrying a name, it was about proving he had something of his own to give. But even then, the comparisons were relentless. Audiences listened to his voice and swore they heard Elvis in it. Critics dismissed him as a tribute act, someone imitating greatness rather than achieving it. And the truth is, no matter how much talent he showed, no matter how much passion he poured into his performances, the debate about his identity drowned out everything else. Imagine living every day of your life knowing people aren't really watching you. They're searching for someone else in your face. That was his reality. And while he leaned into the Presley name, embracing it as part of who he was, the question of legitimacy was a wound that never fully healed. Was he honoring a legacy or chasing a ghost? Was he carrying on a bloodline or wearing a borrowed crown? The personal toll was immense. Behind the shows, behind the headlines, there was a man wrestling with the weight of being both believed and doubted in equal measure. Friends said he carried himself with pride, but also with the quiet sadness of someone who knew that until the truth was proven, his life would always be an open question. He wasn't just another artist trying to succeed, he was a man trying to prove his very existence. And so year after year, he lived in that limbo. Not fully embraced by the Presley family, not fully dismissed either, but locked in a strange purgatory of rumor. Fans debated in online forums. Tabloids published sensational claims. Biographers hinted and speculated, but none could ever give him what he needed: certainty. That certainty finally came with science. The DNA test. For Elvis Presley Jr., it wasn't just about putting the rumors to rest. It was about reclaiming his life. Because a person can only live in the shadows for so long before the need for truth becomes unbearable. And that's why the DNA test wasn't simply a decision, it was a breaking point. After years of carrying a question mark in place of a father's name, he chose to face the truth once and for all. But the result of that test didn't just change his life, It threatened to shake the entire foundation of Elvis Presley's legacy. For Elvis Presley Jr., the decision to take a DNA test wasn't just about science, it was about survival. After a lifetime of living under suspicion and whispers, of being celebrated by some and ridiculed by others, he had reached the point where only hard evidence could free him. A lifetime of rumor had carved scars too deep to ignore. The DNA test wasn't a curiosity. It was the only way to finally know who he truly was. The process was straightforward, but the stakes were unimaginable. A simple swab of the cheek, a sample of blood, a lab where truth could no longer be dodged. But for Presley Jr., every second of waiting was heavy, because when the results arrived, they would either confirm the story he had carried all his life or destroy it completely. There was no middle ground. For weeks, the anticipation built like a storm. Friends who had stood by him for years knew this was the moment he had been both chasing and fearing. Fans who followed his journey speculated wildly. Would this test finally prove that the king of rock and roll had fathered a secret child? Or would it reveal that Elvis Presley Jr. had been living in a dream built on sand? And then the results came. When Presley Jr. finally read the findings, the world he had known shifted. The science was clear. The DNA had spoken, and with it came answers that no amount of speculation could argue away. Yet the revelation was not simple. It was layered, painful, and explosive. The results confirmed what many had doubted. Elvis Presley was not his biological father. The myth he had carried, the name he had worn like armor and burden all at once, was not written in his blood. The king, for all his cultural power, was not his parent. For Presley Jr., it was like watching the ground collapse beneath him. He was not the heir to the Presley line. He was not bound to Graceland by blood. The shadow he had lived under was both lifted and darkened in a single breath. But the DNA also revealed something else, something perhaps even more shocking. It identified his real father, a man hidden in the background of his mother's story, someone whose existence had been obscured by the overwhelming glow of Elvis's myth. Presley Jr. finally had the truth, and it was not the one he or the world had expected. Imagine carrying a name for decades, performing under it, building a life around it, only to discover that science had stripped it away in an instant. That was the heartbreak Presley Jr. faced. And yet, in the same moment, there was relief. Because for the first time, he no longer had to live in the limbo of rumor. The uncertainty was gone. The truth, however painful, was his. The revelation hit fans just as hard. Those who had defended his claim for years were devastated, their loyalty shaken by the cold reality of science. Those who had doubted him felt vindicated, though even they struggled with the raw humanity of the moment. Because beneath the debates, this wasn't just a story about Elvis Presley's name, it was the story of a man finally learning who his father really was. Presley Jr. himself spoke about the revelation with a mix of heartbreak and resolve. He admitted that the results crushed the myth he had carried, but also freed him from the prison of speculation. For once, he could live not as a question mark, but as a man with answers. And though Elvis was not his father, Presley Jr. made it clear that the king's shadow would always be part of his story. The DNA might have ended one chapter, but it also opened another, one that could no longer be argued away. The revelation also reignited a painful debate about Elvis Presley himself. If the king had not fathered Presley Jr., then how had the rumor grown so powerful? What did it say about Elvis's private life, his relationships, and the myths that fans cling to decades after his death? The DNA didn't just reveal a truth about one man, it raised new questions about how much of Elvis's life remains hidden in the shadows of Graceland. For Presley Jr., the moment was both an ending and a beginning. An ending to decades of whispers, but a beginning of life lived with the certainty of truth. Yet, with truth came fallout. Fans, family, and history itself would never see him the same way again. And that's why this revelation was so powerful. because it didn't just answer who Elvis Presley Jr.'s father was, it forced the world to ask what happens when myth collides with science and when a man's identity collides with the weight of a legend. The revelation from Elvis Presley Jr.'s DNA test didn't just close the door on a mystery, it flung open 1,000 others. For decades, he had been both embraced and ridiculed for claiming the most famous surname in music history. And when science finally stripped that claim away, the fallout reached far beyond one man. It touched the Presley family. It stirred the fan base. It rattled the legacy of Elvis himself. For Presley Jr., the results carried the sharpest weight. He had lived his entire life in the balance between myth and reality. With the test confirming that Elvis was not his biological father, he was forced to reconcile a truth he had carried in his heart for years with the truth that was now written in his blood. In one sense, he was freed. No longer would he be trapped by the endless speculation or the harsh spotlight of doubt. But freedom can cut both ways. The name that gave him recognition, the name that opened doors but also chained him to constant scrutiny, was suddenly gone. And with its absence came a painful question. Who was he, if not Elvis Presley's son? The fan reaction was immediate and divided. Some felt betrayed, convinced that Presley Jr. had knowingly built a life around a falsehood. They called him a pretender, an opportunist who had capitalized on Elvis's image for personal gain. But others were more compassionate. They saw in him a man who for decades bore the unbearable burden of rumor, a man who had tried to live with dignity under circumstances none of us could imagine. For them, Presley Jr. wasn't a fraud. He was a survivor, someone who had simply been caught in the gravitational pull of Elvis's legend. For the Presley family, the revelation was equally complicated. On one hand, the DNA results protected Elvis's legacy from the disruption of a newly confirmed son. The family tree, already under the microscope for decades, would not need to be rewritten. But on the other hand, Presley Jr.'s story raised uncomfortable questions about Elvis's private life, about the affairs and mysteries that still swirl around him decades after his death. If the world was so willing to believe Presley Jr.'s story, what does that say about how little we truly know about the man behind the myth? And that is where the fallout stretches into the larger legacy of Elvis Presley. Because the DNA test didn't just disprove one man's claim, it reminded us that Elvis's life, despite being lived under the harshest spotlight imaginable, still contains shadows, unanswered questions, and mysteries the world may never solve. Presley Jr. may not be his son, but the very existence of the rumor speaks to the chaos, the secrecy, and the human flaws that were woven into Elvis's story. For Presley Jr., the aftermath has become a new chapter, one defined not by Elvis's name, but by his own. With the truth out, he has begun to carve out a life free from speculation. Yet even now, the shadow of the king does not fully vanish. For many, he will always be linked to Elvis, not because of blood, but because of the decades of association. And perhaps that is its own kind of legacy, not one of inheritance, but of endurance. The broader impact of Presley Jr.'s revelation lies in the way it forces fans and historians to confront their relationship with Elvis's myth. For years, the Presley legacy has been guarded carefully, with Graceland standing as both a museum and a shrine. But the DNA story reveals something deeper, that Elvis's story is still alive, still shifting, still capable of shocking the world even now. Myths thrive because they live in uncertainty, and Presley Jr.'s story has shown us just how much uncertainty still surrounds the man once called the king. In the end, Presley Jr.'s journey is a cautionary tale about the cost of living in a legend's shadow. He spent a lifetime carrying a last name that was never written into his blood, but was etched into his destiny. When the truth came out, it didn't erase his life. It redefined it. And in that redefinition, it also reminded the world that Elvis Presley's story is far from finished. Because every revelation, every rumor, every DNA test is a reminder that even legends leave behind mysteries too heavy for one lifetime to contain. For Elvis Presley Jr., the DNA test may have ended one part of his story, but the fallout ensures that his name and the questions it raised will forever be tied to the legacy of the king. So what do you think? Did the DNA test finally bring closure to a decades-long mystery, or has it only deepened the questions around Elvis Presley's private life and legacy? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more shocking stories behind music's greatest legends. Greatest legends. Greatest legends.